My name is Patrick Driscoll, and I'm super thrilled that you all can join us for raising a VC fund for diverse managing partners. As the programming board chair for the venture and fundraising group within StartOut and the organizer of this kind of investor-led event, I'm going to provide a brief overview of what StartOut is and its mission and goals, give a shout out to some of our sponsors and Silicon Valley Bank specifically for this event, and then get into some logistics before passing it off to the reason why you're all here to hear from our illustrious panelists. So StartOut is a US-based nonprofit organization. It was founded in 2009 to support LGBTQ+ entrepreneurs and founders. And the goal is to increase the number, diversity, and impact of LGBTQ+ entrepreneurs, amplify the stories, and kind of drive the empowerment of the queer community. And over the past 10 years, we've had some great results in metrics. We have a community of 17,000 members, and we support over 300 entrepreneurs every year. It's a fantastic organization. Special shout out to Silicon Valley Bank for this event, and even one of our panelists, which we'll intro in a bit, is from their wonderful emerging funds team. And these are our additional sponsors. So if anyone on the call is interested in sponsorship, feel free to reach out or check out our website at startout.org. And with that, I'd like to briefly talk about logistics. So at the top of your screen or the bottom of your screen, you're going to see a Q&A function. We're going to get through the panel, which will be about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A. So if you have any questions throughout the actual discussion and the responses from the panelists, feel free to put it in the Q&A. We also have a chat function, which you can utilize to introduce yourself, to share your social media. However, we won't be pulling from the chat function for questions. So please make sure you get your questions in the Q&A function. I'll be monitoring those as well, but feel free to chat amongst yourselves going forward. And with that, I'd like to pass it off to Ian Foley from Level Ventures. He is going to moderate this panel, and that's all I have. Thanks.
Thanks, Patrick. Well, welcome everyone. It's great. We've got a fantastic lineup of some great folks in the industry. Both we have folks you'll see shortly who are venture capitalists themselves, who are emerging fund managers, as well as LPs. It's great to have those two groups in the panel. Before we get ahead, I'll just briefly introduce myself. I work at Level Ventures, and what we do is we help emerging fund managers get started. We have a program to help them get into the business and also help them raise their fund. So that's what I do. On this particular event, I'm here to help you, the audience, learn and ask some probing questions to our panelists. But one thing, and just to start off with, what we're going to do is we're going to do a poll. And the idea of a poll is we're going to do a poll now to ask you some questions. And then we're going to go and ask the panelists some questions. And then we'll get the poll questions back and go understand what insights that you have on where you are in your process of becoming an emerging fund manager. If you raised your fund, you'll see some questions around that. And the purpose behind this poll is to give insight to us, to help you answer some of the questions you may have that come out of the poll. So if you wouldn't mind, the poll should pop up shortly. And as we go through, as you answer the poll, we're going to start the introductions to the panelists. So it should pop up now, and you'll see some questions, 5 questions. If you wouldn't mind just answering away, and we'll go through the panel, and then we'll get to these questions at the end after we've gone through the panel questions. So we appreciate your help. So as you're answering that, let's go down the list of the folks who are here, our great lineup. So let's start off with, Mac, let's start with you.
How's it going, everybody? My name is McKeever Conwell. Most people know me as Mac. I'm the managing partner and founder of Rarebreed Ventures. A little bit about myself. I'm a software engineer by trade, was a government contractor with a top secret clearance supporting the DoD for a long time. Went on to be a 2-time founder, one exit, one not so much. Ended up getting a job working for the investment arm of the state of Maryland, where I started to cut my teeth doing seed investments and later led an initiative to create a pre-seed fund specifically for underrepresented founders. It is the first and only state-backed pre-seed fund for women and minorities in the country. in last September, I left that job to start Rarebreed. And so as part of that raise, we're raising a 506c designated fund so I could publicly solicit. And we crossed the 50% mark today. So we've got commitments for our first 5 million, got another 5 to go. So hopefully by the end of the year. Thank you.
Kelli, when you go next?
Hi all, good afternoon. My name's Kelli Fontaine and I'm with Cendana Capital. I started my career in traditional finance and then I was a founder myself and then joined a startup that did IPO. I've been with Cendana for about 3 years. Cendana's been around since 2010, so really was at the forefront of the seed ecosystem emerging. And so we only do seed, pre-seed and seed funds investing, but we do that globally now. And we have about $1 billion under management, and we're a fund of funds focusing on seed and pre-seed managers.
Great, thanks, Kelli. Charles, when you go next?
Sure, I'm Charles Hudson, managing partner of Precursor Ventures. We're a pre-seed focused fund based here in San Francisco. We've raised 3 funds plus an opportunity fund, and we'll do 25 to 30 investments per year in seed stage founders. Really happy to be here, and nice to see some friendly faces on our panel.
And run up, Daniel, go ahead.
Sure, thanks, Ian. Excuse me. First of all, thanks so much for having me and for having SVB be a part of this. As Charles said, there's some people on this panel that I've really admired and some new and old friends, so glad to be with you. I work in our emerging manager group. I am based in New York City, and what that basically means is it's my job to bring all the resources, network, opportunities that the bank has that's available for emerging managers to them, and to make sure that they know what we can do to be of service. So I've now been in this role for about 4 years. We're a team that is focused pretty much nationally, even though I'm based in New York. Prior to that, spent about 4 years at a seed stage firm called Collaborative Fund. Was there during sort of the early formation from Fund 1 to Fund 3. They've gone on and grown quite a bit since then, but that was sort of my cutting my teeth in the venture world. So yeah, pleasure to be here.
Well, great. Now I've gone through everyone. Let's answer some questions, and hopefully we'll get some good insights from what this panel's about. So I think maybe Daniel, let's start with you. I mean, you are like see the whole landscape. A lot of firms, emerging managers come to you. I'd be interested to understand your perspective on the landscape right now, and really, I think it'd be interesting to understand specifically around underrepresented populations, because that really is the focus of this panel. So just the overall market perspective, and then specifically around underrepresented. Be interested to get your overall insights.
Sure. So the first one is one that, so the overall global view is probably one that won't surprise anyone. There is a lot of capital in the market right now. That's, we've all seen that. But when it comes to raising capital for diverse, underrepresented managers, it's always a challenge to raise a fund. There's no question it's more of a challenge. I think that in some ways we're looking at a market that has done a better job of acknowledging and publicly sort of stating commitments to diversity, which is a positive. It's certainly a step in the right direction. And there are certainly LPs that are designating certain pools of capital to diverse-led funds, which again is great. But I think it is probably still obscuring a bit of how difficult that process can still be. We're certainly seeing one thing that I think is certainly a positive is it used to be that there was very much a designated way that you get into venture capital. You go through a certain type of fund, you do an apprenticeship model, you make some LP connections and ultimately find someone to start backing you. And I think that there are, more channels to get that first sort of bit of publicity and that first push, which is great. But I think a lot of the narratives sort of undersell how difficult that still can be. And so I guess the overall encompassing sort of answer to that is it's improving, but it's still very much a challenge, especially for first-time fund managers.
Interesting. Now, it seems to be that every time I open up a newsletter on industry, there's yet another fund being formed. What do you think as the for this cohort, what do you think is different about this cohort, maybe then from a year ago or maybe 2 years ago in terms of the emerging fund managers? Do you have any insights you can share on sort of the different cohorts and how you think they've changed over time?
I do think that because we're seeing folks come from many different backgrounds, we're seeing more diversity in terms of geography, in terms of strategy, in terms of both career and sort of demographic background. Which again, these are things that are kind of these are shifts that have been happening over a couple of years. I think the recognition of the last year is meaning that there's more of a spotlight on it. But I think part of what's happened is that there's so many folks who have been at this for a number of years that all these new programs are just catching up. And so there's new capital in the market that's designated for these managers, but there's been a backlog for the last few years of folks who have been at this and who have just seen, who haven't sort of come into the market at the point where all this was really available. And so all that is sort of competing for a lot of the same dollars, especially because there is really a limited set, not just of capital that's really designated for underrepresented managers, but also for smaller funds, which first funds tend to be. And so there really just isn't, at some point you would hope that this would level out and you have sort of a more even distribution. But I think we're just hitting that bottleneck where a lot of these new programs that are just coming out are really just catching up to what the market has done over the last few years.
Right, thank you. Now, Charles, I was looking at your background. I noticed that you were previously, one of your startups you started was Bionic Panda Games, which I'd love to know what actually Bionic Panda Games does. But I know after that you then were at Uncork, and now you're rising and you're doing your own fund and have a great success with that. So is the career path you went down, the idea I created a startup, I've got into venture, and now doing my own fund, is that a path that you would recommend others take, or what are some of the advice you give other people who've go down the same on the same journey as they're thinking about starting their own fund?
I think what Daniel said is really important. I think historically, sort of the path I took was the only path that was available, unless you just had access to very high net worth individuals who would back you because they knew you, or you were spinning out of a family office or something. So I felt like when I started Precursor, it was really because Uncork had gotten so large as a fund that our business model and strategy had changed. And I didn't really want to start a new fund just for starting a new fund's sake. At the time, there were probably 1,000 micro VC funds. So in the olden days, when it was only 1,000, now there's obviously many more than that. What I would say is like starting a fund is like the most high friction way to become an investor. And remember, when I started Precursor in 2015, there were angel syndicates were new but not well understood. There were no rolling funds. No one was doing 506c. Like it was this different environment. And I felt like the kind of investing I wanted to do, which is really kind of investing in people at the idea stage, I felt like the seed ecosystem was moving away from that type of investing, except for the case of repeat people. And I just looked around and said, the only way I think I can do this as my full-time job is I have to go raise a fund, because there's no other vehicle. Like if I were doing it today, I'd probably start with a rolling fund. I'd probably do it differently. But at the time that wasn't an option. And so it took me like 2 years. And so what I tell people is starting a fund from scratch, even if you have a bunch of advantages, it's a long journey. And when I say a lot of advantages, what I really mean is if you're leaving a top decile fund, so if you're leaving General Catalyst or Benchmark or Sequoia, and you have some good investments behind your name, and some of the partners from that fund are going to support you, none of the things I just said will apply to you. My guess is that it's probably not true for anybody on our panel or in the audience. And so if you're not, the biggest mistake I see people make is it took me a year to figure out what people didn't like about my fund and the way I positioned it, and another year to fix it. And we didn't really change that much about the fund model per se, but I changed a lot about how I talked about it. And the thing I see happen a lot is people get to that 1 year mark and they're burned out. and maybe your personal runway. And I'm like, you're right at the point where it's going to get better. And I just see so many people run out of gas, either financially or emotionally, at that like 1 year mark. And I'm like, if only you could keep going for another year, you'd get the benefit of having gotten to know these LPs a bit, been in front of them a couple times, got your name out there with founders, built some relationships with other VCs. The cold start problem for raising a fund is really real. And I think the biggest mistake I see people make is underestimating the true amount of just time and effort it takes to get Fund 1 done. And the reward for getting Fund 1 done is you get to immediately start fundraising for Fund 2. So I tell people we're 6 years old. Year 6 is the first year where I'm sort of like, this isn't as hard as it was before. It's still far from easy, but like year 6 is the first one where I'm like, most of the stuff that was hard before is less hard today.
Now then, when you were starting out the first fund, when you left Uncork, was the intention to go after a particular type of investor LP in your fund? Did you already identified a group and you spent that first year trying to talk to that group, or how did your strategy change, if it did, as you went through that journey of setting the fund up?
So sometimes leaving an established platform is a blessing, and sometimes it's a curse. And curse is too strong a word. But like one challenge I had was I knew a lot of LPs from my days at Uncork, but most of those LPs had invested in Uncork 3 and 4 when we had a track record and we had some performance, and Jeff had done a great job building out the firm. And I realized that I knew all those people, but those weren't the right LPs for my first fund. So I had this weird problem where I had like access to a lot of LPs, none of whom were right for my fund. So I spent a lot of time talking to people who I think are incredibly smart LPs who were really helpful to me, and none of them gave me any money. And knowing what I know now, I was like, God, you were so naive. You really thought that like some of these big university endowments were going to give you a check for your what was supposed to be $25 million, but ended up being $15 million first fund. It was just naive. But like the most dangerous thing that can happen when you're naive is actually to have access. And so it took me a while to figure out that like the people who really liked my venture fund were other VCs, family offices, and small foundations and endowments with under $2 billion in AUM. Once I figured that out, fundraising was like honestly a lot less stressful, because I didn't worry like, well, how am I going to pitch this state pension fund? I'm not. They're never going to invest in my teeny fund. Their minimum check is bigger than my whole fund. And it takes a while sometimes to calibrate. And I've seen 3 managers with the same strategy and the same size fund end up with totally different LP compositions because of the manager. Because part of it's you and part of it's the model. And so I can tell you, if you tell me the model, I can tell you the type of LPs that are likely to like your fund, but that doesn't account for who you are. And you'll just vibe with certain people better than others. And so like we found a couple of family offices where we just vibed, and they liked the idea that like our early fund, because we were small, we were going to generate a lot of co-invest opportunities for them. It was super interesting to them. It wasn't at all interesting to the endowments I talked to. They're like, well, we don't care about co-invest. So there is sort of like this product market fit discovery thing that every manager goes through. But I think you can make it more efficient if you figure out the type of LP that's likely to like your fund based on the strategy and size.
I think it's a good segue, maybe. Kelli, as you were hearing what Charles just said there, help us understand what are sort of the size opportunities that you invest in. Do you invest in first-time fund managers, or do you, if someone comes to you early on, are you willing to write a check, or do you prefer to see some track record beforehand?
Yeah, well, so I want to reiterate everything Charles just said. It's super important to know what LPs are looking for. Every LP is buying something different. And so you need to know what you're selling, right? And as you said, product market fit, like what are you selling and what does that LP profile look like? We are a fund of funds. We do seed and pre-seed only, but we do invest only with people with track records. That does not mean it has to have a ton of graduation in the portfolio, that there has to be DPI and exits. It just means we want to see that you have made investments. We want to make sure that there's a network. We can assess, we can talk to the founders you've invested in. We can understand your judgment in choosing these investments and understanding why, and hear you talk about that. So, there's many ways to establish some type of track record. I think the majority of LPs that are institutional are going to want some type of track record. And I think there's many ways with the rolling funds and angel syndicates. There's different ways now to establish that rather than having to go to a fund and having a track record start there.
And one thing that would be helpful to understand is that I know, we talk about funds having LPs, but as an LP, you also have someone you report into, which is the some of these folks who run endowments. Could you just for a second enlighten everyone to understand what they're looking for, because that can also help inform the emerging managers. So do you have any insights you can share, like how some of the people that you get capital from, what they're looking for as well?
Yeah, so I think, we are in a unique position. We can reiterate what Charles said. It took Michael 2 years to raise fund 1, right? We're on fund 4, going to raise fund 5 next year, but the first one took 2 years. It gets easier, but I'm not going to tell you our last one raise was smooth and super easy. We did just do a pass the hat for a nano fund you mentioned back, and that was to our own LPs, and we launched Cendana Nano, and that's really to invest in sub $15 million funds, because we realized that we were missing out on a lot of these fund ones. As Charles fund 1, it wasn't a right fit for us because our check sizes are $7.5 million for pre-seed and $15 million for seed. So, I mean, we can be half of a fund, but it's just not how we construct our own portfolios. But going back to our investors, the endowments and foundations, I don't want to put this is not meant pejoratively, but they're allocators. They have a mandate and they're looking to fill that mandate. So when you're talking to family offices and to high net worth individuals, they can be more creative and forward thinking on strategy, or if you're trying to pitch something new and differentiated. But for foundations and endowments, they have a thesis around portfolio construction. They have a percentage of capital allocated for this specific area, and they assess how to fill it. And talking about how they do that and how we do it, I think it's a lot of our networks. And so LPs talk to other LPs, but really our managers. And those are some of your best advocates for, if you want to get in front of us or you want us to take you seriously. If our managers are co-investing with you, or they have worked with you and they can advocate for you, I mean, we're going to take that seriously. Obviously, we put our money behind those managers and we believe in them and love their work. So if they're advocating for you, the back channel references are huge. But getting into foundations and endowments, as mentioned by Charles, it's probably not going to be fund 1 unless you have a established track record from inside a great fund. And that's a different slog to haul. I don't think there's many foundations endowments that are doing fund 1s of emerging managers.
So, and I'm sure a lot of people out there thinking, I'd love to have a chance to connect with Kelli. It sounds like she has exactly the type of a way of funds that could help me. How can people actually get in front of you, or at least get noticed? Because you have, I'm sure your inbox is full of everyone interested in your time. So what differentiates an over the transom opportunity one from the other? Some obvious ones like a referral, but others that people could think about who may not have a referral, may not know someone who knows you. Can you help describe some ways that you're responsive to those cold leads?
Yeah, I think it's really about going back to like how Charles put it, it's the product market fit, right? If we're just seeing, we just invested in supply chain, but we thought it was an interesting area because we've seen an increase in startups in that area within our own managers. So it's obviously an area that's growing. When we see it in our own generalist, then it's an area we should take more note of. So there's certain things that you have to realize that, again, it's all very opaque. I understand, like, understanding what LPs do and what they invest in is very opaque and it's difficult to assess, but it's trying to find out what these LPs do. And you do have to find some way of understanding what they're doing. Otherwise it's spamming. I mean, if there's 1,000 of you, if there's 1,000 funds out there and they all are coming to us for money, then we can't take 1,000 meetings to assess. So it's really trying to make yourself stand out and find a way in. Again, it's through our managers, it's through our LPs, through other LPs, through people. We have a deep advisory board. If you work in a specific industry, it really has to be network, because that's one of the things we invest in, right? Is how you can use your network to find startups. So if you can use your network to get into us, then we'll trust that you can use your network to get into the startups you want to get into.
Mm-hmm. Well, Max, this is a good opportunity to put you on, because I know that you've created a really interesting profile on social media. Do you feel that got you in to opportunities, or do you think it's your differentiated approach has just been further reinforced by your social media? So how important has that been to you, do you think, in terms of getting meetings the likes of Kelli?
The only reason I've been able to raise a fund is because of Twitter. Like, if I'm just going to be completely honest, like, Twitter is the reason why I've been able to raise my fund. It's the reason why I've been able to close on 50% of my fund since September. It's like, it was this cross section between COVID, George Floyd, and Twitter. It's the reason why I can raise a fund, right? And to be quite honest, I had spent 4 years working for the investment arm of the state of Maryland. The problem with that is it was very insular, because we only invested in companies based in Maryland. And so even though I've been able to build a bit of a track record and invest in some really great companies, nobody nationally, like, largely knew me. Like, I had a network of folks nationally. Like, I knew Charles, right? Like, I knew folks, but I didn't have very large of a presence. And when I went to go raise my fund, I very quickly realized I didn't have a network of LPs. I knew how to source companies. I could source companies from all over the country, all over the globe. I had networks to source deals. I didn't have a networks to source LPs. I didn't know what that looked like. And so when I got stuck trying to figure that out, I just figured, like, I need to talk to more people, like, how to do this. And so what happened was, after George Floyd getting killed, I had some things I had to get off my mind, and so I started tweeting more, but then I just kept it up. And as I kept tweeting, I noticed more and more other VCs were following me. And so I just made it a point, like, hey, if I saw you were a VC and you followed me, I'd send you a DM for a meeting. And so from the middle of June to the middle of September in 2020, I had over 1,100 meetings that all came from Twitter, right? And as I was meeting folks and talking to them, I'll never forget this. I had a conversation, and it was with Elizabeth Yin from Hustle Fund. And I'm just talking to her, telling her about what I'm thinking about building and what I'm doing. And she's like, that's interesting. What's your minimum? I say, well, my plan for my minimum be 10K. She's like, I would love to be a part of that. And that was the first time I recognized that other VCs, or other GPs, often will be LPs and fund ones. And so once that light bulb went off in my head, it was like, this is the strategy. And so since June of last year, I've had over 4,000 meetings. And those 4,000 meetings have led me to raise the first 5 million in my fund, and, started deploying capital. So for me, like, it only happened because of social media.
Now then, in terms of, as a fund, you moved on to fund 2, how do you think you're going to raise fund 2? Do you think that this is obviously a winning strategy? You raise a good amount of money. Do you think this is will basically be the strategy going forward, or do you think that there is, increasing your track record, I assume will play a role, but how important do you think social media is going to be going forward too?
I think I'm going to get to a point where social media is still going to be important it's going to help with growing the network. It's going to help because, like, my social media presence is a value add to my entrepreneurs, right? Mm-hmm. Like, if an entrepreneur of mine needs some help, I can put a tweet out and get a bunch of people who can respond to a question or support my founder. So that's important and that's valuable. When it comes to fundraising, my goal is to grow my AUM over time. Like, I plan to grow my fund over time. My goal is to have a large multi-stage firm based here in Baltimore, like a Green Spring, like an NEA, both Maryland-based firms. And so my goal is to be the next one of those. And so the social media strategy helps with visibility, but didn't necessarily help me close an endowment or institutional LP, right? It means that institutional LP may have heard of me, right? So I can get a meeting, but what's going to help me, what's going to get me to close is going to be my performance, right? This is a performance-based industry, right? This is a performance game, right? This is how you make it. It's based on how you do. And so I'm now getting to the point where I do have a network of LPs. who can get me in front of endowments and institutional investors. And so when it comes time for fund 2, I'll probably have a more structured process. Like I kind of brute force the first one because I didn't know anything else. Like I didn't know anything better. Like I'm just running around in circles, bumping in the walls, trying to figure it out. And somehow I ran into a door and like, hey, there was money. And then I started bumping the walls again. Like the next time around, I'm gonna actually have like, I'm gonna know where the doors are and like know where the light switches are and be able to go through. And so I hope that fund 2 will be slightly different. But as Charles is talking, all I can feel is like my heart race because like 6 years from now, so when I start to feel better, like, but that's part of the strategy. And a lot of it for me, the struggles was just as a first-time Black fund manager, like even when I started my first company, I didn't have a network, and so like I had to figure that out. That took me 2.5 years to do. So like now, being a fund manager, I'm going through the same process, and that's also why Twitter and social media is going to be important, because as I meet other fund managers who are trying to do what I'm doing, I want to make sure they don't run around in circles bumping the walls too. And so like I need to make sure I'm always talking about this kind of stuff. So social media will always be a part, but for fundraising, probably less so.
All right, thank you. And now Daniel, what strategies have you seen which are kind of innovative? I think social media is a kind of interesting and new approach to go and help raise. What else have you seen out there that and when you advise emerging managers of how they differentiate themselves and raise their profile? Do you have some insights to share from your large number of clients?
Sure. I guess, the thing I really admire about what Mac has done in terms of what he's built is that he's really been authentic to who he is. And Twitter has worked because he's comfortable there. He's comfortable communicating with large groups of people. He's comfortable communicating who he is and what he wants to build in that kind of a platform. It doesn't mean Twitter's for everyone. I mean, I can say for myself, like I am very uncomfortable on Twitter. And so it's not where I find myself like, connecting with folks. So I think the biggest thing is figure out like where your path is. It might be in one-on-one communications. It might be sort of in small groups. I'd say the biggest thing that I try to communicate, and this sounds a lot easier than it is, but is when you start to fundraise, you got to find who your true believers are before anything else. You got to find who's going to go with you no matter what, I remember one of my friends was telling me that he's going to raise a fund. And my first thought was like, how can I help you? Like, I want to be there like alongside, and excuse me, he said he was going to do something new. I said, how can I help you? I didn't know it was a fund. I didn't know if it was a company. I didn't care. I just knew that this was someone that if he was going out on his own, I wanted to somehow be able to be a part of it and do whatever I could to help him out. And so I think you got to start there, because that's going to build your momentum. It's going to build your confidence. It's going to make you feel like you have some wind behind you. And from there, you just got to keep, and sometimes you got to keep grinding. And I'd say one thing that I was just thinking about this as Charles was speaking earlier, but one of the things that is a big, frankly, gatekeeper within the venture community is referenceability. Is a lot of times that you won't be, you'll hear about like reference check and whatever, but a lot of these are like check the box kind of reference checks. But I was thinking about how a collaborative fund, one of our anchor funds for the second fund became an anchor, got to know who we were, because when he was asking a founder about a different company, that founder said, oh, but have you spoken to these guys? And this was a big endowment that had never heard of collaborative funds. He said, that fund that you're asking about is wonderful. You should also talk to this other one. And that's, I would say, as a, when I figured out the power of that, is something I would say to other managers. If you have other managers in your network that you think are wonderful, if you're getting calls, like don't just tell them about the one that they're calling about. Tell them about the other ones, because a lot of these folks might not even be on their radar. And so hearing from Charles to say like, oh, Mac's got a new fund. If you haven't heard of him, you should really talk to him. That's meaningful. And so, there's people at different parts of this journey. And so making sure that you're kind of like looking out for the different folks that are also in that, like different steps of it, I think is a really, really powerful way to sort of, increase that exposure, because not everyone's going to be able to do it on Twitter.
That's helpful. Now, Kelli, let's say someone's had a chance to get in front of you there. You now start talking. How long should they expect this process to last? How long do you go typically from first discussions to actually cutting a check and putting into someone's in someone's bank account, hopefully an SVB bank account. That's right, Daniel?
Yeah, exactly. We're big fans of SVB and happy clients. I think it depends on the manager and the extent of our relationship. There's managers that we have invested in where we've had a multi-year relationship with. As Charles said, they weren't ready, they weren't the right people for fund one, but when a fund two or fund three comes around. So there's people that we invest in. When we started investing internationally, we've been talking to these people for 10 years before we invested. So this is a long game. And one thing to remember is that you all invest in founders, and you quickly know within 18 months where that journey is going to go. And somebody else can come in and take over the reins. We are investing with you for a 10-year fund and hopefully multiple more funds. So it really is a deeper relationship that we really assess. We're betting on you. We don't know the portfolio yet. We don't know the companies. We're betting on you. And so you have to be patient and realize that it's a total relationship game. And so I can't really put a timeline on it because if we've known you for 10 years, and it could be a day, right? But
Right.
It's more of, if we're just getting to know you, we spend a lot of time doing back channel references, as Daniel said. That's where we get the insight from founders of why they chose you, how they met you, to understand your network and where you're getting the referrals from, and how you work with them, right? We want to know what your value add is and if they're going to be your proponent, because the best deal flow for you is always going to come from other founders once the flywheel's spinning. So we really assess these things. And I think, it takes a lot of time for back channel references and to get people on the phone, talk to co-investors, founders. But I would say the majority of our diligence is around that, getting comfortable with new ecosystems, new sectors, those things take longer for us because we have to internally come up with a thesis and research that as well. But so there's no process that I can point you to. But remember, it's just a relationship game and it takes a long time.
All right, one final question, then we'll go over to the polling pieces here. So if you were having a bit of advice to someone who maybe Daniel, one of your friends who is about to start his fund, what would you recommend that they do in terms of what would be a good bit of advice? The first thing you would say, what would you recommend?
Is that back to me?
Yes, back to you, Daniel.
Yeah. I think one of the hardest things is actually, it's exactly what Charles said, is you got to mentally prepare yourself, because it's always going to feel, no matter how easy your fundraise is relative to anyone. Some people be like, oh, you did it in 18 months. That's so much easier than this. When you're in it, you are stuck in it, and it is constant, and it is just a grind. And so there's no way to say like, don't worry, it's not as hard as the other one. And so I think the biggest thing is just managing your psychology around that, is preparing yourself, is having a network around you, people who will support you, people who will remind you why you're doing it, because there's gonna be days where you're definitely not gonna want to, and there's gonna be days where it's just not gonna feel worth it. And like Charles said, you're gonna look at either your personal runway or your exhaustion. But if it's really what you believe in, then it's worth pushing through a lot of those things. But make sure that you have all those things set up so that you can succeed within those challenges, because they're going to be there. No matter how easy or hard your fundraise is relative to anyone else, when you're in it, it's a bear. And especially when you're a solo GP and you're doing it by yourself.
And how about you, Charles? Any bit of advice if you were telling a friend of yours who was saying about to start my fund? What would you first thing you'd say?
I mean, I don't have a ton. I'll tell you one thing that I wish I had appreciated. I meet a lot of, and I do a little bit of LP investing of my own. I think every GP thinks that their story is unique and special. And once you've seen 100 decks, you're like, these all kind of feel the same. And I think it takes a while. I tell people, like, if my main takeaway from your deck is that you're a smart person with a good network, like, try harder. And I honestly think, like, a lot of the fundraising decks I see, I'm like, in a world of thousands of managers where like the good LPs already have a pretty firm stable, this story is not good enough to get you over the hump. And I feel like a lot of first-time managers don't get real feedback on, like, is what you're doing actually different? I tell people, like, there's two ways I think you can raise a fund. One is a macro story. There's something about the environment that you get that's not obvious to other people. And like that was our pitch with Precursor. It's like this pre-seed thing is a big deal and people don't get it yet. Or there's a micro story. There's something truly special about you as a fund manager and your access to your past performance that makes you unique. And I'd say 90% of people that I meet who should be pitching a macro story are pitching a micro story about themselves. And I'm like, I don't know how to say this nicely. You're like actually not that special. Relative to everybody else who's raising a fund, they're all like you. They're very smart. They have a great network. They have a strong resume. They work at great companies. Like that, winning on those dimensions is really hard as a first-time manager. Whereas I think if you know something about the ecosystem, it could be a geography, it could be a fund stage strategy, it could be a sector that gets you out of the like smart guy or gal or person with a generalist idea. If you can get out of that lane, like I really push people hard to figure out how to get out of that lane and into like a better lane that has like less traffic.
It's a really good point. Any thoughts from you, Mac? And then we'll go on to the poll.
For me, it's really a cross section between what Charles and Daniel said, right? Like, you don't know how non-differentiated you are until you're in market. And you start getting friends who are other emerging managers, and like you start looking around, it's like, why does everybody's fund sound the same? Why does everything look the same? It's almost like startups, the same way we like, it's really hard for me to invest in like social networking apps because there's a million of them. I've seen so many of them before. Well, if you think about it from the other side, LPs, like they've seen all the funds before. And like, do you really think that your strategy's that different? Right? And to Charles's point, like pre-seed was the thing in 2000. It wasn't the thing in 2015. Today, everybody's talking about pre-seed. Everybody's still getting it wrong, but you hear it all day, every day, right? Mm-hmm. And so like really understanding how to be differentiated, and then also understanding that there are going to be funds that are differentiated, that are going to get invested. And it's the same thing like with startups, where you see founders who are raising capital pre-product or pre-revenue. Like, why can't I do it? Because that's about their network. They're not differentiated. They're smart like everybody else, but they had the right network to get the LPs. And so yes, there's going to be a couple of those. And if you're not one of them and you're trying to compete with those folks, you're going to have a hard way to go. And then to Daniel's point, this shit is hard. Like, excuse my French, but this is hard. And the one thing I wish I had done before when I quit my job at the end of August to really do this full time in September, I left my job on the Friday, and that Monday, I just had a wall of meetings. I wish I had took 2 weeks off. I wish I had taken a vacation. I wish I had taken some time. But to Charles' point, I'm not that far off of that year mark, and I've hit a wall, and it's hard and it hurts. Like, you're not getting sleep. You're not spending enough time with friends and family. If you got significant others, like, I hope they understand, because you're not going to be present the way you always said or thought you would. Like, this job takes a lot. And so finding time to be ready for it. And when you're in it, if you need to just take a day and just cancel every meeting and take a day, learn that that's okay. Learn that every meeting you cancel can come back. Like, it's not the end of the world, but you got to make sure you're good to go through this, because this shit is hard.
I think it's a good point. I think the other point, just like any startup CEO, is that it's the partner, your life partner, who you're with, also has to understand where you are as well. It's not just you're going through it; it's the people around you going through it, and educating them as much as yourself is also super important. Well, good. Let's now go to the poll. Does everyone see the poll? So Patrick, does everyone see the poll, or is it just me who sees the answers? Everyone sees it. Oh, fantastic. Okay, great. So I'm looking at the first answer. So it looks like from most people here would like to raise a fund, haven't put investor debt together yet. So they're still like working it out and trying to determine. So I suppose, Kelli, one for you here. If someone's at this stage, this is, remember you were saying how that get to know me early. that this could be someone, 2 years out. Is that the time where, and if someone's 2 years out and thinking like, I want to do something in 2 years now, what should they be reaching out to you with? Should they be saying, hey, Kelli, I saw this interesting article on this particular topic. Does this interest you? Or I like your investment in that company or that fund. Is that the type of way that they should start to engage with you at this far out?
Yeah, I mean, we start relationships before funds are formed. When people are at companies, when people are at other funds, they reach out and want to establish a relationship and really understand how we think, how LPs think, learn from us. And that dialogue of we're here to help. I mean, that's what we do as well, right? So we want to help educate and help, form. So we do start the relationships before a fund is formed as well. And I think asking those questions and getting the right answers, and also then forming your own thoughts around it early before you start, is super helpful for you too.
Okay, good. Now let's look at number 2. What type of fund are you looking to raise? It seems like generalist and then enterprise. Now, in terms of Charles, you focused on that pre-seed. I take it did you choose a focus within an industry subsector, or is it just a thesis around pre-seed? Did you have any other thing beyond that?
No, and I knew we were going to be reasonably high volume, so I was like, I don't know how we can run a conflict-free portfolio at the pace I want to invest if we take a sector thesis. Also, there was no sector where I was like, oh, I don't have like a deep thesis on B2B fintech or insurance. I was sort of like, I just like people. I like people and ideas, and like I don't really care about the sector that much. And I think I'd be happy as a generalist. And again, to Mac's point, when I started Precursor, there were not a lot of pre-seed funds out there, so there was just more surface area to be generalist because that part of the market wasn't as crowded. I think it's harder today.
Mm-hmm. And Daniel, what's your thoughts on this? Have you seen a shift towards enterprise? Looks a lot of enterprise and SaaS here. Looks like the two significant ones, and fintech. Do you have any trends that you're seeing at this particular point? Like the next cohort, are you seeing inundation with folks, doing crypto funds or retail crypto funds or things like that? What are you seeing of interest?
I feel like it usually comes in waves based on sort of what's hot either in the public markets or the later stage markets. And so right now it's fintech, it's enterprise, it's crypto. I'd say those are the ones we see the most over the last year or so. But yeah, I mean, I think I think ultimately you need to find, as Charles said, like where your lane is and sort of invest there, figure out where you're going to have the best deal flow, because ultimately that's what's going to sustain you. And just as a general matter, we have this conversation on my team a lot. And I'd say, all VCs, I think if you can, in an overarching way, talk about all VCs, you say VCs are opportunists. They're looking for where the best opportunity is. And I think at the very beginning, when you're starting small, your opportunity, your surface area, like Charles said, is much smaller. And so you kind of like try to figure out, where can I get in the best deals here? But as you grow a little bit and as your profile grows and you can get into more deals, it expands a little bit. And so I think, at a certain point, you kind of like start, it's like finding product market fit. You find your wedge, you kind of like get that, you hit that, and then you open up from there. And so, so I think that, it can work. I think almost in every situation, you figure out sort of like where your spot is, but there's an expectation that over time, that surface area for you will grow.
All right, good stuff. Now, question number 3, what do you think is the biggest challenge to raising a first VC fund? I think we all heard throughout this is identifying the right LPs. I mean, Charles, you described your journey, was really insightful. Now, Kelli, a question for you here is that most people don't necessarily understand what LPs is structured like. So it's not just identifying the right LPs within LP. Can you explain a bit about the LP manager and what they do and who's the right person to talk to, and how do you know you're talking to someone who's actually a decision maker at an LP and someone who's not? So can you just provide some understanding if they are identifying, let's say, the right LP, help us understand a bit more about what's like on the inside of an LP?
I don't think there's a wrong person to talk to actually at an LP. It's kind of like, if you're talking to a principal level or partner level within a bigger VC firm, if you have an advocate within the firm or fund, they're going to keep mentioning you and be an advocate. So I don't think it matters who within an LP you establish a relationship with. If you vibe and really get along with somebody, ride that relationship. It doesn't matter where they sit within the organization, if they're on the operating or admin side, if they're vouching for you. Firms are not that big, or endowments, even like they collaborate, they work, we're all teams. And so if you have somebody that you work with and trust and respect and they're advocating for you, then that's the right person. So the way LPs are structured, it depends how big. Some family offices, they have private teams. Other people just have one CIO and they cover all asset classes. So it depends on the LP, and it's kind of you do need to understand, do they have a privates team, or are you talking to the public markets team? So you should be in somewhat of the right vicinity there. But again, anybody that you have a good rapport with, keep that up, right? It doesn't matter if they're the decision maker or not. They're going to be the one mentioning you in team meetings. They're going to be the one advocating for you.
Great. Now, this next one down was securing a lead LP. Now, Mac, I know that you shared interesting insight about finding other VCs. Now, what do you say there is a lead LP who is like an individual? Is there someone you felt helped corral others into participating? Help us walk through that story of working with individuals as LPs.
So I have some LPs in my fund whose names are well known, and being able to talk about them being LPs has been helpful, right? And so Carta last week put out a thing saying that they invested in several diverse fund managers, and I was one of them, right?
Right.
And having Carta put that out publicly saying they were an LP in my fund brought me into 10 new LPs, right? Like people were like, oh, Carta invested, this is awesome, right? Having Michael Seibel from Y Combinator as an LP has, turned heads and made people interested. Now, do you know how much he put in my fund? No. Am I going to tell you? Of course not. Does it matter? No. What matters is that he's willing to vouch for me enough that he puts skin in the game, right? And so even if it is somebody like a Charles Hudson and he puts in a small check, well, all you need to say is like, hey, I don't care about the size of your check, but if I send people you as a reference, or will you be willing to tweet and say that, hey, I'm really excited for what Max is doing, I'm really excited for Rarebreed. That goes a mile. And so it doesn't really matter per se on the size of the check, more so than that person's profile, and are they willing to vouch for you in the future. Another one is First Close Partners. Ed Zimmerman and his wife and the group they put together, they're LPs. And just the way we talk about being value add VCs, like a lot of VCs talk about value add. And as value add, what do? We say we help you with follow-on funding. We say we help you get customers. We help you when you need things, right? Same thing for LPs. You want to look for value add LPs. I can't tell you how many other LPs Ed's introduced me to, right? Like that's important. The ability to be like, hey, can you get me this introduction? I want to talk to this LP. Sure. Right? Like those things go a really long way. And so when trying to identify the anchor, don't think about in terms of size. Like people think about anchor LPs, the size of the check. No, think about the profile of the person and how they can help you get networked into other LPs. And again, like my theory and thesis on and how I think about this is kind of skewed because I started raising a fund during COVID. So like I have yet to go to a GPLP conference where I hear this is how all this stuff happens. And I have yet to meet a contractor who like finds GPs and takes them to LPs, right? Like I haven't gone through those networks yet. I'm going to like eventually, like that's going to be a world. But like for me, it was like finding the right person with the right profile who was willing to vouch for you, who was willing to say, hey, yeah, you can put out an email and put my name on it. Like, that's fine. Like, those have been some of the most impactful things.
Well, good. And I think that's interesting when I think on terms of the finding the right impact for people who can drive it forward. Now, and the next question actually is, where do you think you'll secure the majority of the LP capital? And I think everyone is, I think from this call is heard now that it's family offices, high net worth individuals, and that's reflected also in the audience. So everyone is aligned there. Let's move on to question 5. I want to make sure we have time for the Q&A at the end here. So what do you expect with the size of your first fund? Charles, well, how much did you raise in your first fund?
15 million, and I wanted 25. Then I wanted 20. Then I was like, I think I can be happy at 15. Because I knew like I needed 10. I mean, like for me, like I was like, I need 10 million to do this full time, which is the rule of thumb I tell people. It's like less than that, the management fees, like forget about paying yourself, just like operating the fund gets really tight. Sub 10. So I'm like sub 10, like as a full-time thing. Do it if you have to, but you really need to change that for fun too. So we got to 15, and basically I was like, I don't have more people to pitch. So 15 it is.
And Daniel, in terms of the folks that you're seeing right now, what is the do you have an average on what is the size of the first time fund? Do you have statistics you could share on that?
This is not empirical, but this is more anecdotal. It's usually, I'd say, probably 20 to 25 is sort of the target. But to Charles's point, they don't always end up there. But I think I see more often than not that's usually what we're seeing folks go out for their first fund. And
how about you, Kelli? What are you seeing in the marketplace at this current time? Does this jive with what you're seeing?
Yeah, we see a lot of the 25 targets.
20 to.
Yeah, we see a lot of the 25 targets, but we created Nano specifically for 15 million and under, and we think that's probably the right size for first-time managers. We did analysis across our fund, all of our fund investing, and did ownership, talk to LPs about what their specifics are. We obviously really love portfolio construction and we want to be the largest LP in a fund, and we want our fund managers to be the largest investor. And so looking at ownership to fund size, it starts actually kind of mattering at 25 million. Anything below that, it's not as impactful. And so we think, really 15 is a good Goldilocks first time fund. We have in our Nano, we do have smaller funds that we have a $7 million fund and a $10 million fund. So as Charles mentioned, it really should be the MVP, minimum viable product that you can go and live on and deploy.
And then how soon after that first fund should people be considering raising their second fund? When does that process begin? Maybe Charles will say on day one of having received the first.
Yeah, that's one thing I wish I could do over. I was so exhausted from fundraising for Fund 1. I felt like I needed a break, but I also felt like I didn't have anything new to talk about. But if I'd really gone back and looked at them, like, oh, even the people who said no to me, some of these people I haven't talked to them in a year. And like, there is this like desire to take a break, and you should take some break after you finish a fund, but I don't take breaks in between funds anymore. There's always somebody on the LP side that I want to get to know better, where it's been long enough since I talked to them that whatever I tell them will feel like news, because it will be news to them. And I think getting in the habit of like always be on the lookout for opportunities to talk to LPs that you want to meet. I keep a list of people that I don't yet know that I want to find a way to get to know and tell them what we're doing. So there are ways to like take whatever LP energy you have. Like sometimes you're like, I can't go back and have the fourth conversation with that person who told me no 3 times. Take that energy and like direct it elsewhere. If on that day, to Mac's point, if on that day you're like, I don't have the energy for that, find new people. So I'm in the mode that we'll always be talking to new LPs for the rest of our fund's life, even if it feels like on paper we quote unquote don't need them. You never know what's going to happen in the world, and you never know when you're going to meet a great person that you want to have as part of the franchise.
Well, that's a great way to round out this out. So let's pass over now to Patrick. Do you want to take us forward on the Q&A? And I think we have about 50 minutes left. Is that right?
Indeed. And I know Mac had to jump, so thanks to him as he silently exits. If you did notice in the chat, his final comment was AVP, always be pitching. So keep that in mind. Yeah, so thanks so much. And again, if anyone has additional questions, make sure that they go in the Q&A. We do have several, so I have a strange feeling we won't be able to get through all of them. And this is kind of an open question for everyone. And since it is Pride Month and this is StartOut, I wanted to ask a little bit of a specific question around communities. So for specifically the LGBTQ plus community, anyone who's looking to raise a fund, do you have any advice for someone who, in terms of where they should start, who they should go after in terms of network building, any organizations? And this could kind of be brought up to more of a macro level for different communities, but since this is StartOut and kind of Pride Month, it'd be great to get that perspective.
Well, I think starting with you guys would be the first right place to go. You've got like amazing community, so it's like engaging with the community is there. You know, getting involved in social media, being involved in your events. You know, build a profile. There's great people I know on the board of StartOut. So you know, right in front of us is a great organization to get started with.
I also would just add, sometimes, like, I'll just say like a weird story. The second biggest LP in my fund is someone I met through a founder that I turned down for investment, but he and I became friends. And he introduced me to a family office that had invested in his company. And that family office ended up being my second, and that person didn't do it like thinking, oh, he's just like, oh, this family office talked to him. I think Mac brought this up, or maybe it was Daniel. Like, they talked to him and they're like, oh, there's this guy in San Francisco you should meet. He's been helping me even though he turned my company down. He's like, still gives me advice. And they were 15% of my first fund. So what I would tell people is like, there's a certain amount of this that's like strategic and surgical about like building a list. There's also a certain amount of this, which is like the opposite of being a stealth startup, which is like telling as many people that you have access to what you're doing. You never know where you're going to find LPs. So I would say like the LGBTQ plus community is like pretty well organized now relative to maybe previous times, and getting people in your community to understand what you're doing. Like, I felt lucky. There were a lot of Black founders who wanted Precursor to be successful, whether we gave them money or not, because they wanted to see us exist. And there are people like who did favors for us or like told people about us that I had no idea how this person found out about us until after the fact. They're like, oh yeah, this person I'm friends with, he's on my men's basketball team, and we were hanging out and he asked me if I knew. And so like, I would say, don't forget that everybody in your community can help you if they know what you're doing, because you never know where those connections and introductions and meetings will go.
Awesome. Yeah, and definitely check out StartOut. We have a ton of great networking opportunities. You never know who you're going to meet at one of our events. There are several other specific kind of affinity funds with Loud Capital. Obviously, backstage, Arlen has a great story about how she raised her first funds, and then you can kind of go that route. Now, the next question I have is specifically around tools and platforms to help with fund management. And Mac kind of mentioned that Carta invested, but are there specific tools that folks would recommend to help get organized when you're creating your pitch, to being able to pitch with LPs, and then finally kind of managing fund one afterwards, kind of in that strategic way? Probably Charles would be good for this one. Kelly
can go first, because Kelly's on the receiving end probably of a bunch of this stuff, and then I can give you from the GP side.
I think you just have to go with number one, a good law firm that you like working with, and that's something that you're going to pay up for. But you know, that's extremely important in getting that correct first. And then as far as fund admin, Carta's great. There's also a handful of fund admins that really work with the emerging managers and really help you get organized on the finance side. We really like VMS, Aduro, Standish. And so I talk to other GPs on that you like how they're organized, but I think a good fund admin and a good legal firm are really important in starting the fund and taking some of the burden off of you. And those are fund expenses that don't come out of your management fees.
I would say on the GP side, decide on a CRM system that you can live with and love. Like we use Affinity, and I like it because it requires relatively little effort because it syncs with Gmail or Office 365. Because you'll be surprised. You'll say, I just talked to that LP last week. And you look in your CRM and it was 9 months ago. And you're like, oh, geez. And it also just makes it so much easier to help people, to get help from people. If someone says, well, who are you talking to? If you can produce a simple report that shows these are the LPs I'm talking to, the same way you would ask a portfolio company, how can I help you with introductions? You'd expect them to show you, these are the VCs I've reached out to. And these are the ones that have helped. I'd give one other piece of advice to GPs is like, some LPs are very particular. They have to have, it has to be PowerPoint. Can't be PDF, can't be a Dropbox. Like it has, if someone tells you they really need something in a certain way, just give it to them in that way. Like don't get too caught up in the tools that work best for you. If an LP says, I can't do a downloadable data room, I need this as a zip, like whatever the thing is, and like I could tell you tons of stories of things people have asked us for, give it to them in the format that they want, that they need to do their job, even if it's slightly less convenient for you.
I think another point is also to mention is how actually important the fund management piece is. I mean, there's a lot of great managers who, when they have infrastructure of a brand around them, perform, and often they find it really hard when they're doing it all themselves. And you may be lucky and raise fund one, but if you can't, to Charles's point, deliver the information format that they want, or that you don't, you neglect some of the components that they expect on someone else, it will be a tick against you, because that and you're looking to raise fund two. So competition in performance isn't just in excelling in performance in terms of the return. It's being able to help the LP deliver on what they need to do to report back ultimately to their customers, their endowments, etc.
And one thing to pay, I mean, that Ian, that was basically where I was going, which is really just to say, whatever tools you do end up using, make sure you do them from day one. I can't tell you how many firms sort of just get into the grind of, I'm fundraising, I'm looking at, I'm doing so many zillions of things at once, I'll take care of this later. And it just becomes so much harder. Just, figure it out, get something in place, and make sure you're kind of following those, those procedures as early as you can. You don't want to be in sort of that kind of procedural debt later.
If I can add one last thing for anyone out there who's thinking about being a solo GP, everybody thinks that the tax and the burden is on the investing side. It's not. It's actually on the fund management side. I tell everyone, like, running a VC fund, it's 3 businesses. It's a fundraising from LP business, it's a deploying to startups business, and it's running a small professional services fund that has its own tax, accounting, bills to pay, filings to manage. And that third thing, nobody gets excited about doing it, but it's absolutely critical. And as a solo GP, that's actually, I find, the hardest part of the job to stay on top of, which is why we have a part-time CFO now.
Great. I kind of love this question. So it is a hustle when you're raising your fund, and obviously you're not making significant amounts of income. And you talked to Charles a little bit about hitting a threshold in terms of your fund to be able to actually be able to do it full time. How do fund managers, when they are fundraising, actually support themselves financially? Is it just they need a ton of savings beforehand? Any advice around what to do before you actually launch your fund?
I can go if you like.
Yeah, I think that would be
I think savings, for me, there were 2 things that made it work. One was savings, which was a big part of it. I think if you do this at some point, if you're starting your own fund, you're going to touch money that you probably hadn't planned to touch. And I just tell people, like, there's pools of capital you probably had set aside for other purposes. Your fund will probably make a claim on those at some point, if you're like most people, which I think is actually a good test of how serious you are about doing it. Second, I was fortunate. I was like winding down at Uncork when I started Precursor. So I had a venture partner relationship with Uncork, which did help smooth it. I know other GPs who've had venture partner or other kinds of like, I don't call them side businesses, but like related interests and activities that have like smoothed out the pain, but it does take a lot of money.
I will say one of the things that we did with Nano is that we know that we're investing in, a lot of times it's not their full-time job, right? I think LPs that are investing in emerging managers are sensitive to the fact that, you know, you have to have a certain background or whatever. There's a barrier to entry if you're saying that you have to support yourself. So a venture partner role, or even a role within an organization that keeps you actually in the loop of hearing people spinning out or starting companies, you can be more in the flow of, you know, deal flow, if you will. So we actually have in Nano are looking at people who have full-time jobs. And, you know, you can say, once I hit a certain number, I plan to leave. That's another way to work on the fundraise. Again, you know, it's already the burnout without the side job, but.
Great. Now, I think we have time for one more question. We have so many questions, so apologies to those that have asked. But the final one, I did want to ask a little bit about the virtual world as opposed to in-person GP LP meetings and kind of those matching events. So geographically, we have several attendees who seem to be out of the coastal regions, and they're running into issues, and they're trying to identify ways where they can utilize a virtual world to their advantage. Do you have any advice for folks that might be located in a non-hub of LPs specifically?
Well, we heard from Mac. Mac did a crushing job, didn't he? That's a good strategy. It's basically creating a brand name for yourself.
I think something about your geography that makes your story part of the story, right? It's networks that these LPs haven't touched, or if your geography is part of your story, to make sure that that resonates and is part of the story of why you're reaching out to LPs.
I mean, I would just point to someone like Jonathan Treist at Ludlow. He's a Detroit-based venture firm, really good returns, invests a little bit in Detroit, but not a ton. And so I think to Kelly's point, just because you're not, I think the default assumption for most people is like, oh, you're in Cincinnati. Well, it must be a Cincinnati. But it doesn't have to be that way. And I think if you're in a geo, but you have access to really great deals outside of your geo, I think there's probably more openness to that now than there was before. But I can name 5 or 6 other people that are based in one place and invest in founders in another place and are very, very good at it.
Awesome. Deanna, did you have something you'd like to say?
I mean, more the obvious, which is that LPs right now are more willing to meet and even commit over Zoom than we even expected when I would even say a few months into COVID, when it was like, we're only doing old relationships. We're not going to put any new names into our portfolio yet. So will that stay? TBD. But I think there's certainly an opportunity there.
Great. Well, I believe that is all the time that we have. So thank you to everyone. Before we go, I did want to mention that we do have an upcoming demo day, which is on June 22nd, 4 p.m. PT, 7 p.m. Eastern time. So feel free to register. We have some fantastic companies that are going to come through and pitch. I know we have a ton of GPs, existing fund managers on the event, so remember to mark this on your calendar. And we also have a great investor matching tool internally at StartOut. So if you're looking for deal flow specifically from the LGBTQ+ community, we have a pretty strong and robust portfolio. So keep that in mind. And with that, thank you for joining us. Thank you so much, Ian, for being an amazing moderator, Kelly, Daniel, and Charles. And Mac, of course, who had to jump. It's been a pleasure to get to know you and hear your stories. And from StartOut, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.